I had been hiking for hours, and the sun had started its slow descent behind the distant hills, casting long shadows through the trees. The trail I was on was familiar, but somehow, today, everything felt different. The air had a dampness to it, a thickness that clung to my skin and made the forest seem even more suffocating than usual. The kind of humidity that soaks into your bones and makes you feel like you're trapped in a wet blanket. I had planned this trip weeks ago, an overnight solo hike through the woods. I had done it plenty of times before, always with a sense of excitement, but today, there was something off about it. Maybe it was the quiet. The forest was usually alive with sounds. The chirping of birds, the rustling of squirrels in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig from an unseen deer. Today, though, it was eerily silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your mind start to create sounds that aren't really there. I brushed it off, deciding it was just my imagination, and pressed on, pushing my pack higher on my back as I trudged through the undergrowth. The ground beneath me was soft and spongy, the remnants of last night's rain still lingering in the earth. I could feel each step sink a little deeper, the mud pulling at my boots like it didn't want me to leave. As the sun dipped lower, I knew I needed to find a good place to set up camp before it got dark. I'd already passed a few decent spots, but something about them didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way the trees crowded together, their trunks so close that they blocked any wind, or how the ground sloped just slightly, making it hard to imagine getting a good night's sleep. So I kept walking. The deeper into the woods I went, the more I began to realize just how isolated I was. The trees were getting denser, the path narrower, and the silence more profound. It was the kind of isolation that made your thoughts echo in your head, loud and sharp, reminding you that you were alone, without any help nearby. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity of walking, I came across a small clearing, a perfect place to set up my tent. It was nestled between a cluster of old, gnarled pines, and the ground here was flat and dry, far better than what I had passed earlier. There was a small creek running nearby, its gentle babble a calming sound in the otherwise oppressive quiet. I set up my tent quickly, eager to be finished with the physical labor so I could settle in for the night. The process was second nature to me by now, the way the poles snapped together and the tent fabric stretched tight against the evening air. I unpacked my sleeping bag and a few other essentials, making sure everything was secure. As the last light of the day faded, I lit a small fire, using the dry wood I had gathered along the way. The fire crackled and popped, and I sat beside it, the warmth creeping into my chilled limbs. For a moment, I thought about how peaceful it all was. The world outside the clearing felt far away, the weight of my everyday life temporarily forgotten. But as I stared into the flames, that strange feeling from earlier began to creep back. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the air, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. I had been in the woods alone plenty of times before, but this felt different. The woods weren't like they usually were, alive and full of life. This place felt empty, cold even despite the warmth of the fire. I ate a quick dinner, a dehydrated meal that wasn't anything special but filled me up just the same. As I finished eating, I stood and walked over to the creek to wash up. The water was cool and refreshing, and as I splashed my face, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a deer or a large bird passing through the trees. But when I turned, there was nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and my skin grew cold despite the warmth from the fire. It was only a moment, a fleeting glance, but it was enough to unsettle me. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be. There was no one else here. I was alone, and that was the way it was going to stay. I returned to the fire, stoking it with a few more pieces of wood, and sat back down on the log I had been using as a seat. The crackling flames were comforting, their dance a hypnotic rhythm that helped calm my nerves. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. That something or someone was out there, just beyond the edge of the clearing, watching me. I tried to push the thought away, but it lingered in the back of my mind. I had no reason to be afraid. But the woods had a way of getting into your head, making you second-guess your instincts. The wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves above me, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was the sound of something moving in the trees. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was just me being paranoid. I spent the next few hours by the fire, trying to read a book, but my focus kept slipping. Every crack of a branch, every snap of twigs, made me look up, my heart skipping a beat each time. But no matter how much I searched the shadows, there was nothing there. Nothing but the trees, their long, twisted limbs reaching up into the sky like skeletal hands. Eventually, the fire began to die down, the flames flickering lower and lower until they were nothing but embers. I stood up, stretched, and yawned, feeling the exhaustion of the day settle into my muscles. It had been a long hike, and the solitude was starting to wear on me. I was ready for bed. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and laid down on my sleeping pad. The silence outside was deafening, and the air inside the tent felt close and humid. I pulled my sleeping bag around me, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that had settled over me. My mind kept going back to the movement I had seen by the creek. It had been so quick, so fleeting, but it felt real. Too real. As I lay there, trying to force my mind to calm down, I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. It was faint at first, like a distant rustling, the kind of sound that might be made by a large animal moving through the underbrush. But then it grew louder, closer. I held my breath, straining to listen. The rustling continued, slow and deliberate, moving in a circular pattern around my camp. Whatever it wasn't trying to hide. It was making its presence known. My heart raced as I listened, every muscle in my body tense with fear. The sounds of the forest, once so familiar and comforting, now felt foreign and threatening. I grabbed my flashlight from the corner of the tent, the beam cutting through the darkness as I shone it toward the entrance. The beam flickered slightly before illuminating the trees outside, but there was nothing there. No movement, just shadows. I held my breath, hoping it was nothing, just some animal out in the woods. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just an animal. The way the rustling circled my camp, the way it seemed to be getting closer, it felt deliberate, like something was hunting me. I lay there for what felt like hours, frozen in place, listening to the sounds grow louder, closer, until they were right outside my tent. I could hear the crunch of dry leaves underfoot, the sound of something large moving in the darkness. And then silence, absolute, suffocating silence. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. My flashlight was still clutched tightly in my hand, but I was too terrified to turn it on. I could hear my own heartbeat, thudding in my chest like a drum. The seconds felt like hours. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The rustling faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing in the still night air. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my flashlight beside me, watching the shadows outside my tent, waiting for the slightest sign of movement. But nothing came. The woods outside were still, silent once more. Morning eventually came, bringing with it the first light of dawn. The world outside my tent seemed to breathe again, the familiar chirping of birds and the rustle of the wind through the trees calming my nerves. But the unease didn't fade. The sense that something had been watching me, that something had been close, was still there. I packed up my camp quickly, not bothering to make breakfast or even fully clean up. I just wanted to leave. The woods felt wrong, too wrong to stay any longer. I hiked out of the clearing and back toward the trailhead, my heart still pounding in my chest. When I finally reached my car and turned the key in the ignition, I looked back at the woods one last time. The trees stood silent, still as they always had. But I knew now for certain that something was out there in those woods. Something that had watched me, and for reasons I would never understand, had let me go. I drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel, the strange weight of the woods pressing on my chest. It wasn't a ghost or some fantastical creature from a fairy tale. It was real, whatever it was, and that's what made it so terrifying. I've always loved hiking, Ever since I was a kid, I've enjoyed the solitude that the woods offered. The quiet, the rustling leaves, the sense of being at one with nature. There's nothing else like it. But that day, the day I decided to venture deeper into the woods than I ever had before, was different. I had always stuck to the marked trails. They were safe, well-worn, with little risk. But this time, I felt a pull, a need to go beyond. I woke up early, before the sun fully rose, eager to make the most of the day. The morning was crisp, and the air had that fresh, earthy scent that comes with the dawn in the wilderness. The forest was still asleep. The only sounds were the soft chirps of birds waking up and the occasional rustling of something small moving through the underbrush. I packed light, a few snacks, water, a map, and my camera. I wasn't expecting to get lost. In fact, I wasn't planning on venturing off any trail at all. But once I hit the main trail, something inside me urged me to go further. The main trail was well marked, the kind where you see other hikers from time to time, but soon enough the path started to narrow. The trees seemed to grow taller, their branches creating a dense canopy that blocked out the early morning sunlight. It felt like I was being pulled into something deeper, something more mysterious, but I kept going. After a while, the trail faded. At first, it was just a slight change. Some overgrown patches, a few fallen branches here and there, but eventually the path was completely gone. I stopped for a moment and looked around. I could still see the occasional mark on a tree, maybe a small pile of rocks that had been placed to guide hikers, but the trail had become faint. I hesitated. I had maps. I knew where I was, but the further I went, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving behind something familiar. The noise of the forest changed too. It wasn't the usual light sound of birds chirping. It was a strange silence, as if the air itself had thickened and the trees had absorbed all the noise. It was the kind of silence that makes you uneasy, the kind that makes you start listening harder for sounds that aren't there. I pushed forward, convinced I could handle it. The woods weren't something to be afraid of. They were just trees and animals, the same as any other forest I'd been in. But as I walked, the shadows seemed to grow longer, and the trees seemed to close in around me. There was something off about this place. The deeper I went, the more it felt like I wasn't supposed to be there, but I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination. By midday, I'd lost track of time. I was far from where I started, far past the area marked on my map, and yet the woods kept stretching in front of me. The silence was deafening, and even the wind had stopped blowing. I noticed how dry the ground was, too. Normally, after a night of rain, the forest would be damp, but the soil here was cracked in places, dry as if it hadn't seen water in weeks. There were no signs of wildlife either. No squirrels, no birds, no insects, just the dry crackle of leaves underfoot. I stopped to take a break, sitting down on a large rock covered with moss. I opened my water bottle, took a sip, and surveyed the area around me. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like long fingers. I felt like they were watching me. The longer I sat, the more uncomfortable I became. I stood up, ready to move on, when I noticed something in the distance. A flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. I squinted, but it was gone. Maybe it was an animal, maybe just the wind playing tricks with the shadows. I decided to ignore it and keep moving, but my unease was growing. There was no sound, no rustle of leaves, no wind. The whole forest felt unnaturally still. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, not more than a few hours old. A single set, deep in the soft earth, leading off the trail. They were too big to be an animal, too wide to be from a person in hiking boots. I bent down to examine them more closely. They weren't shaped like normal human prints either. They were more like the shape of boots, but wider, almost too wide to be possible. They looked like they had been made by something heavy. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. I considered turning back, but I didn't want to seem scared. Besides, I had been hiking these woods for years. I could handle this. I followed the prints, curious to see where they led. The deeper I went, the stranger everything became. The forest felt increasingly isolated, as if the trees were closing in around me. The only noise was the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I wasn't sure how much further I should go, but the prints kept leading me onward, their strange shape growing clearer the further I walked. After what felt like hours, I came across something odd. A clearing, large but unnaturally so. No trees, no brush, just an open space. And in the middle of it was a structure. It wasn't large, but it was definitely man-made. A small shack, the kind you'd find in an abandoned part of the woods. The walls were covered in moss, and the roof was caved in, partially collapsed. It looked old, but not abandoned for too long. I should have turned back then, but curiosity got the best of me. I walked toward the shack, the feeling in my chest tightening. As I got closer, I noticed something strange about the ground around the structure. It wasn't just dirt. It was covered in a layer of small, jagged rocks, almost like a gravel path that led up to the door. I reached the shack and stood there for a moment, trying to decide if I should go inside. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see into the dark interior. The air was musty, stale, and smelled faintly of decay. But there was something more, a sense that something had been there not too long ago. I pushed the door open, cautiously stepping inside. The floor creaked under my weight, and I took another step. The darkness inside was thick, the kind of dark that feels oppressive. I couldn't see much, but there were strange markings on the walls. Symbols. Some looked like scratches, others were just odd shapes I didn't recognize. My eyes scanned the room, but there was nothing else inside. No furniture, no signs of life, just the markings on the walls and the feeling of being watched. I turned to leave when I noticed something at the far corner of the room. A pile of what looked like old clothes, tattered and stained. I walked over to it, my heart beating faster now. As I got closer, I realized that the clothes weren't clothes at all. They were something else, something I couldn't quite put into words. Before I could step back, I heard it, a rustling noise from outside. I froze, standing still, straining to listen. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone or something was moving outside. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of the shack and back into the woods, my heart racing. The eerie stillness had returned, and the only sound now was the pounding of my own feet against the dry ground. I kept running, trying to ignore the dread building up in my chest. After what felt like hours, I finally found my way back to the trail, my breath ragged, my legs aching. The woods didn't seem as menacing anymore, but the unease lingered. I didn't look back. I made it out of the woods that day, and I never returned. But the memory of what I found, and what I felt in those woods, still haunts me. I don't know who or what was watching me or what the strange footprints and shack meant, but I'm certain of one thing. There's something out there, something that doesn't want anyone to know, and I'll never go back to those woods again. I've always loved hiking, the calm that comes with being alone in the woods, the fresh air, and the silence. It's a feeling I can't really describe, but when I'm in nature, nothing else matters. The thought of being surrounded by nothing but trees, dirt, and sky somehow makes the usual noise of life fade away. But this trip was different. I didn't expect it to go the way it did. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, just as the sun started to dip behind the trees. The park was nearly empty. A few cars lined the parking lot, but no one seemed to be around. Perfect, I thought. I preferred it that way. I grabbed my pack, double-checked that I had everything. Food, water, my first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, a map of the trail, and a good knife. The basics. I wasn't planning on staying overnight, but I always pack as if I'm going to be out there longer than I think. You never know. The trail I chose was a little off the beaten path. I liked it that way. Less traffic meant fewer people, fewer chances for interruptions. It wasn't too hard to follow, but not many people used it. The trees were dense, with only patches of sunlight breaking through. The air smelled fresh, earthy. There was a slight chill, though it wasn't cold. Just a crispness that reminded me fall was just around the corner. I started walking, taking in the surroundings. The path was narrow, with the trees towering on both sides. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and I could hear the crunching beneath my boots. It was peaceful, like I was the only one alive in the whole world. My mind wandered as I walked, thinking about everything and nothing. It wasn't unusual for me to lose track of time in the woods, and today was no exception. I walked for hours, lost in the beauty of the landscape. Eventually, the trail began to wind uphill, and I noticed that the farther I went, the less familiar the surroundings became. The trees were larger here, older, their trunks wide and gnarled. I could barely see the sky anymore. The canopy was too thick. The air felt heavier, as though the woods were pressing in on me. I didn't like the way the forest felt here, but I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was just the change in the weather. I stopped to drink some water and sit for a moment. The stillness of the place was almost unnerving, but I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The sun had set by this point, and it was getting darker. I still had some daylight left, but I knew I needed to think about heading back soon. I had no intention of camping. The last thing I wanted was to be caught in the woods after dark without a solid plan. That's when I noticed something strange. At first, it was subtle, a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned, but there was nothing. I figured it was a squirrel or some other small animal, but then I saw it again, a shape shifting behind the trees, just at the edge of my vision. It wasn't an animal. It was too large, too deliberate. I stood up slowly, trying to stay calm. My first instinct was to brush it off. There's always something, right? The wind, shadows, my own imagination. But this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. I took a few cautious steps forward, peering into the darkness between the trees. Nothing moved, but my gut was telling me something was wrong. My breath started to catch in my throat. I told myself to calm down. There was no reason to get paranoid. But then, I heard something. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps on soft dirt. Slow, deliberate steps. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't an animal. I was sure of it. The woods were so quiet, and yet, I could hear those footsteps as clear as day, crunching against the leaves. They were close, too close. I didn't move. I didn't want to make a sound, but I had to know what was out there. I crouched down low, trying to stay hidden. I strained my ears, listening for any other sounds, any sign that someone else was out here with me. But there was nothing, just those slow, methodical steps coming closer. And then, just as quickly as they started, they stopped. The silence returned, thick and heavy, like the air had been sucked out of the woods. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. There was nothing. No movement, no noise, no sign of anyone or anything. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I stood up slowly, trying to gather my thoughts. My legs felt shaky. I glanced around, but everything seemed normal. Too normal. I forced myself to turn around and head back the way I came. I wasn't going to hang around and wait for whatever that was to come back. The darkness was swallowing the path, and I felt an undeniable urgency to get out of the woods. I made my way downhill, walking faster now. I didn't know why, but I had this feeling that something was following me. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're certain you're not alone, even though you can't see or hear anything. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my eyes kept darting to the shadows between the trees. I could hear the crunching of leaves again, but this time, it wasn't from me. I picked up the pace. Every step I took seemed to echo in the stillness of the woods, but I couldn't bring myself to look over my shoulder. I knew if I did, I wouldn't like what I saw. Suddenly, there was a loud snap, a branch breaking underfoot. Not from me, not from anything I could see. I froze, feeling the blood drain from my face. I didn't know what it was, but I was sure it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too intentional. I didn't stop to look. I just ran. The path was steep, and the ground was uneven, but I didn't care. My heart raced as my feet pounded the earth. I didn't dare look behind me. I didn't want to know. My only thought was to get to the car, to get back to the parking lot where there were people, where there was safety. The trees seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing deeper with every step. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, to keep running. The only sound I could hear now was the pounding of my own feet on the trail, and the distant, rhythmic sound of something following behind me. I didn't know how far I ran. The path seemed endless, like it stretched on forever, but eventually the trees began to thin out. I burst through the final stretch of the woods and saw the parking lot ahead. My car was in sight. I didn't slow down until I reached it. I practically threw open the door, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it. I sat there, panting, my hands shaking. I stared out into the darkened woods, but nothing moved. The woods were silent once more. I don't know what it was that followed me. I don't know if it was a person or something else entirely. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that trail. Ever. The woods have a way of playing with your mind, and once you've been in the deep woods long enough, you start to realize something. There's no such thing as truly being alone out there. And sometimes, it's better not to know what's watching you. I set out into the woods that day like I always did. There was something peaceful about it. The solitude, the smell of the earth, the crunch of leaves underfoot. I didn't need company, didn't need conversation, just the quiet hum of the forest around me. I'd done it countless times before. Long walks into the woods with no particular destination, just to clear my head, think or not think at all. But that day, something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a heaviness in the air, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. The woods were dense here, thicker than most places I had hiked in the past. The trees were old, gnarled, their trunks twisted like ancient fingers clawing at the sky. The sun barely pierced through the canopy, casting dappled patches of light on the ground, which was soft with layers of fallen leaves. The smell of earth and decaying wood was so rich that it felt almost tangible, as though the air itself had weight. I'd been walking for a couple of hours, the trail growing fainter with each step. This wasn't a marked path. It wasn't one of those neatly maintained hiking routes you could find on any map. It was a small, overgrown trail I'd stumbled upon once and had followed ever since. Every now and then, I would stop, look around, and marvel at how wild it felt, how untouched, as if I had wandered into some forgotten corner of the world. It was the kind of place where you could get lost easily if you didn't know where you were going. But I never minded that. I liked the idea of losing myself, even if just for a little while. As I pushed further into the woods, the feeling of unease grew. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes you freeze or run. It was a slow, creeping discomfort. Something about the way the trees seemed to close in on me, how the trail narrowed and twisted in strange, unexpected ways, felt off. It was as though the forest itself was changing, reshaping, reacting to my presence. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the rhythmic sound of my boots against the dirt, the occasional snap of a twig. I hadn't seen any other hikers in hours, and the silence was almost oppressive. The wind wasn't even moving the leaves anymore, and the only sound came from my footsteps and the faint rustle of critters hiding in the underbrush. Eventually, I came across a small clearing. It was a strange one, round and isolated, with no visible entry point from the other side. The grass in the middle of it was unnaturally green, almost glowing in the soft sunlight, while the trees around it seemed to bend inward, creating a natural barrier. I stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. It didn't seem right. The clearing was too perfect, too symmetrical, like something that didn't belong in nature. I stepped closer, feeling a strange pull toward the center. As I approached, I noticed something half buried in the grass. A metal object, dark and weathered. I crouched down and uncovered it. It was a small, rusted box, no bigger than a shoe. The metal was coated in grime and dirt, and the hinges were so rusted they looked as if they might snap if I tried to open it. Still, my curiosity got the better of me. I wiped off some of the dirt and managed to pry it open, though it felt wrong. It felt like the woods didn't want me to open it, but I did it anyway. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in cloth, worn from age. My heart started to race, a sense of dread creeping into my chest. I carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a small, faded photograph, curled at the edges, and a small, tattered book, its pages yellowed and fragile. The photograph was of a man, standing in the middle of a similar clearing, his expression grim, his clothes torn and dirt-streaked. The trees behind him were unnaturally crooked, bent in a way that made them look as though they were reaching for him. I turned the photo over, but there was nothing written on the back, just a blank, faded piece of paper. The book was just as strange. It was old, very old, and the cover was marked with strange symbols, none of which I recognized. The pages inside were written in a language I couldn't understand. It wasn't just a different script. It felt ancient, almost otherworldly, as though it had been written by someone who had never meant for others to read it. I flipped through the pages slowly, my fingers trembling, and then, at the very end of the book, there was something that stopped me cold. A drawing, roughly sketched, showing the same clearing I stood in, with the man from the photograph standing in the middle. But this time, the trees around him were no longer just crooked. They were twisted in unnatural, grotesque ways, their limbs reaching out like claws. And in the distance, just beyond the trees, there was something else. Something that looked like a figure, a person, but it was twisted and distorted, too far away to make out clearly. I slammed the book shut, my breath shallow, and stood up. I wasn't sure why, but everything in me screamed that I needed to leave. This wasn't just some strange coincidence. The box, the photograph, the book, they were connected to something that the woods didn't want me to find. And now that I had found it, I could feel it watching me. The weight of the trees around me seemed heavier, pressing in, as though they had been waiting for this moment. I turned and started walking back the way I came, but the trail seemed different now. It was no longer a familiar path, it had changed, twisted. The trees seemed to close in on me, blocking my way. I couldn't see the trail anymore, just a maze of roots and brush. The air felt thick, like I was moving through molasses. Quickened my pace, panic beginning to rise. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, and my breath came in short gasps. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just the dark, silent woods. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if the forest itself was alive, aware of me, following me. Every time I glanced behind, I thought I saw something, just a flicker, a shadow moving between the trees. But when I turned, there was nothing. I ran then, my legs burning as I pushed through the thick underbrush, the trees seeming to close in tighter with every step. It felt like the woods were closing around me, trapping me. The path ahead had vanished completely, replaced by a dense wall of ferns and branches. I stumbled, falling to my knees, but I didn't stop. I crawled, scrambled, desperate to get out of this place. And then, as I was about to give up, I saw it. A break in the trees, a sliver of daylight shining through. I crawled toward it, ignoring the sharp pain in my legs, the branches that whipped across my face. The moment I broke through the tree line and into the open field, I collapsed. I lay there, gasping for breath, staring up at the sky. The weight lifted, and I could finally breathe again. The feeling of being watched, of being pursued, faded with every breath I took. The woods were behind me, and whatever had been waiting there stayed within its dark depths. I stood up slowly, trembling, my body sore, and turned to look at the tree line. The woods were still, as though nothing had happened. The sun was setting now, casting a golden hue over the horizon. I took a deep breath, turned, and started walking home. I don't know what I found that day, or what I disturbed, but I know this. I'll never go back to that part of the woods again. The forest has a way of holding onto its secrets, and some things are better left undiscovered. But more than that, I learned something in that moment, something I'll never forget. Some places aren't meant to be found, and once you find them, it's not so easy to leave. But I made it out, and I never went back. The woods were silent, as they often are when you're far enough from civilization, with only the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. It was late autumn. The trees still clung to the last of their orange and yellow leaves, but most had fallen, leaving the ground covered in a thick carpet of dried foliage. The air was sharp and crisp, and every breath seemed to cut into my lungs. I had been hiking for hours, deeper into the forest than I had originally planned. It was one of those spur-of-the-moment decisions to get away from it all, to find some peace, and just get lost for a while. The trail had been easy to follow at first, but as the hours passed and the light began to fade, the path had disappeared into the underbrush. I was used to this sort of thing, though. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness over the years to know how to navigate when trails weren't visible. I had my compass, a map, and my own instincts to guide me. But as the evening wore on, something started to feel off. At first, it was just a sense of unease, something I couldn't quite place. The woods seemed denser, more oppressive, the trees crowding in on me. I chalked it up to the isolation. You know how it is. Being alone in the woods can sometimes play tricks on your mind. But that feeling only deepened as the sky darkened further. The wind had picked up, and with it, the sound of branches scraping together, like whispers, strange murmurs that didn't seem to have a pattern or rhythm. I should have turned back at that point, but I didn't. Maybe it was pride, maybe curiosity, or maybe just the stubbornness that comes with wanting to prove to myself I could handle it. I kept walking deeper into the forest. The shadows grew longer, and soon, the fading daylight had slipped away completely, leaving only the cold glow of the moon filtering through the branches. By then, I had lost any sense of direction. The forest all looked the same, dark, tangled, endless. My compass was pointing in a direction that didn't match the terrain, and the map felt useless in my hands. I was in the middle of nowhere, and all the familiar landmarks I had relied on had vanished. The isolation was complete now. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. The air was getting colder, and my heart was starting to race. It wasn't from exertion, but from a feeling that was gnawing at the back of my mind. It felt like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every small sound seemed amplified in the stillness. A snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. They didn't feel natural. They felt deliberate. I quickly brushed the thought away. It was ridiculous. I was just letting my mind get the best of me. But even as I thought that, I felt an undeniable pull to keep moving, to get out of the area I was in. I took a deep breath and started walking again, trying to ignore the discomfort creeping into my thoughts. I don't know how much time had passed, but the moon was high in the sky now, and the forest had become a maze of twisted trees and thick underbrush. The path I had been following seemed to fade even further, and the only thing that kept me going was the thought that if I just kept moving, I would eventually find my way back. I had to. The rustling sounds came again, but this time, they were closer, much closer. I froze, my feet rooted to the ground, my senses straining to pick up any hint of movement. It wasn't just the wind anymore. There was something else, something that didn't belong. For a moment, I considered turning back, but that would mean retracing my steps through this dense forest in the dark. I wasn't sure I had the energy or the courage for that. The thought of the unknown, of what might be out there, made my skin crawl. But I couldn't stay here either. I forced myself to move, even though my body screamed for me to run. Suddenly, I heard something that made my blood run cold. An unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. It wasn't a person, but something much larger. The noise was slow, deliberate, and seemed to be coming from behind me. I didn't dare turn around. Every step I took felt too loud, like the sound of my boots hitting the ground was echoing throughout the forest. But I couldn't stop moving. I needed to get away. I pushed through the underbrush, my arms and legs scraping against the thorny branches and thick foliage, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was following me was getting closer. The dragging sound persisted, and then, to my horror, I heard something else. A soft, guttural grunt, followed by the sound of something wet and heavy hitting the ground. My mind raced as I tried to piece it together. What was that? What was chasing me? I had no answers. All I knew was that I needed to keep moving. So I did. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but the dragging sound didn't stop. It was constant, keeping pace with me. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sound abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was suffocating. I had to know what was behind me. My heart thudded in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I forced myself to look over my shoulder. There was nothing. The path behind me was empty, the shadows as thick and undisturbed as the rest of the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hiding in the darkness, watching me. I pushed myself forward, my legs aching from exhaustion, my mind clouded with fear. I had to get out of this forest. But as I continued walking, the forest seemed to close in on me, the trees standing taller, darker, more oppressive. The moonlight barely broke through the canopy anymore, and my surroundings had become a blur of dark shapes and faint outlines. And then, without warning, the ground beneath me gave way. I yelped as I tumbled forward, my arms flailing to catch myself. I landed hard, pain shooting up my arms and legs, but I forced myself to roll and stand up. My hands pressed against the earth as I tried to steady myself, but the ground around me felt unstable. I looked down and realized I had stumbled into a shallow pit of sorts, a depression in the earth surrounded by rocks and roots. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to make me stumble, and now I was disoriented and even more vulnerable. I climbed to my feet, shaking the dirt and leaves from my clothes. I had no idea how far I had fallen, but it didn't matter. What mattered was getting out. I couldn't stay here, trapped and vulnerable. But then, as I looked around, I saw something that made my stomach turn. It was a small clearing just ahead, barely visible in the dim light. But what made it stand out was the unmistakable signs of a campfire. Burnt wood, a circle of stone, and the faint smell of smoke still lingering in the air. Someone had been here recently, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the fact that the campfire pit was abandoned. There were no signs of life, no tents, no sleeping bags, nothing. But there were scattered footprints around the fire pit, large and uneven, like someone had been walking in a hurry. They were fresh. And then, on one of the rocks surrounding the fire pit, there was a small, tattered piece of cloth, half buried under the dirt. It looked like it had been torn from a jacket or bag. I knelt down to get a closer look, and when I touched it, I felt a sharp sting of panic. The cloth was stained, dark stains. It wasn't just dirt. I quickly stood up, my heart racing. The dragging sound had started again, far off in the distance. But this time it wasn't just dragging. It was louder, faster, and closer. I had no choice. I needed to run. With everything I had left, I pushed myself through the underbrush, fighting the trees and roots that seemed to reach out to stop me. Every time I thought I was getting farther away from the clearing, the sounds of movement behind me seemed to grow louder, the dragging noise turning into something more frantic, almost like pursuit. My legs burned, my body screamed in exhaustion, but I kept going, blindly running, until I found myself on the edge of the forest. And then I saw the road. I didn't stop. I ran straight to it, not caring if I stumbled, not caring if I fell. I was out of the woods. The sound of the dragging stopped. The pursuit was over. I was safe. But as I sat down at the edge of the road, gasping for breath, I looked back once more. The trees stood as silent as ever. But in the distance, where the forest had swallowed me whole just hours before, I could have sworn I saw something shift in the shadows. And then it was gone. I didn't know who or what it was, but I was out, and I wasn't going back.